I am Games, and I hereby solemnly swear to review every GameCube game over the next 35 years. Luigi's Mansion was a launch title for the GameCube down to its bones, continuing a tradition the company has of building their launch titles in tandem with the console itself, letting their development shape one another. Luigi's Mansion caused the expansion of the head on the controller's C-stick and the inclusion of dynamic lighting into the console's graphical abilities, while the game's control scheme was gradually altered into something which would be simpler to play with the layout the controller eventually settled on. Originally, Luigi's Mansion was being developed with Mario as the protagonist, which doesn't seem too weird when you consider how he'd receive his own backpack apparatus not long afterwards, but he was swapped out with his brother because the team wanted a more cowardly character in the leading role, or so they say, though it's equally likely that they knew gamers would more readily accept a game so different from the traditional Mario formula as a console launch title from the franchise if it didn't star Mario himself. Whatever the case, they stuck Luigi in his first legitimate leading role and finally nailed down his first ever significant character trait, being a total goddamn scaredy cat. Consider that the Mario launch title for the Nintendo 64 was Super Mario 64, one of the most legendary video games ever made, in a lengthy, fully featured 3D platformer adventure. Right from the start, Nintendo had pushed the idea of a game about jumping in a 3D environment about as far as their imaginations could take it. What the GameCube offered by comparison, besides a graphical step up, was simply an increase in the specificity of what could be accomplished in that 3D space. More precise controls and aiming, better camera movement, and generally greater clarity of what's going on were the GameCube's strongest selling points. I am willing to believe that Nintendo flat out didn't think there was any need to upgrade the graphical capabilities of their consoles beyond this point, since doing so would no longer significantly expand on what the player was actually able to do in a game, which is why they got into the business of motion controls and touchpads in the coming generations. But when they arrived in a future wherein gamers were getting used to higher and higher standards of photorealistic graphics, they inevitably had to step up their game. While Mario 64 would eventually receive a proper sequel in the form of Super Mario Sunshine, which pushes the GameCube's apparent capabilities a lot farther than Luigi's Mansion, it's easy to see how this game was meant to take advantage of the step up in hardware. The central gimmick of sucking up ghosts is a frenetic looking frenzy of animations, as players manage relatively precise if also slow and forgiving line of sight control with their vacuum, while terrified ghosts scramble to escape from the airflow, jerking the player all over the place. When you get a hold of several at once and try to lasso them all in from different directions, it's hard not to think that no other game had pulled off anything this visually impressive on a home console yet. Weirdly, Luigi's Mansion's control scheme is both its main draw and its worst problem. Stunning a ghost with your flashlight and then sucking them up with the vacuum is massively satisfying when you pull it off in one fell swoop, or when you're dragging a ghost like it's a fish from the Ocarina of Time minigame and convincingly mirroring its movements in order to suck it in. Tracing after a ghost with your flashlight is meanwhile frustrating, because the camera is set at angles which make it awkward to determine the exact spatial relationship between Luigi and his surroundings. A top-down approach would have made the vertical height of enemies unclear, and a flat horizontal approach would have done the same for the gamer's depth perception, but since the most conducive method to twin-stick aiming in a three-dimensional space is a first-person viewpoint, there really is no other perfectly satisfying angle to judge these relationships, and the ones which the game inconsistently swaps between never give you the opportunity to really get used to the sluggish C-stick aiming with Y-axis inversion that you can't disable in time for a first playthrough. When you really pare it down to the core mechanics and look at what you have to do to beat the game, Luigi's Mansion is shockingly arcadey for a Nintendo game from 2001. If you know where everything is, you can easily make a beeline through the mansion, skipping all the optional content and blasting through bosses if you've mastered the controls. It's a game you could speedrun in under 4 hours just naturally on a second playthrough if you paid attention to your first go-through, and the world record is just over an hour for a 100% run. It's a completely linear game, a solved one, insofar as there is an easily detectable most correct order of operations, with the hardest variables being holding on to the ghosts all the way to the end, and frankly this doesn't seem to always be possible. I would assume that there is some kind of RNG being rolled against the timing and distance of your vacuum blast, since the pro strat seems to be continually pressing the trigger over and over again, but ghosts will still escape from the stranglehold, most likely a deliberate choice on Nintendo's part to keep the ghost battles consistently fresh and exciting, though at high level play I can imagine this becomes infuriating in how it makes runtime times unpredictable. This is not to say that I want to accost Luigi's Mansion for failing to be as satisfyingly endlessly replayable as it could possibly be. In fact, I really do think that shaking up the ghost encounters with some unpredictability does enhance the freneticism of a first-time playthrough in a welcome enough way that, with the reasonable expectation that most players aren't going to play this game over and over again, it could be justified. Having said that, if you had a GameCube at launch and didn't find Super Monkey Ball or Wave Race Blue Storm to your taste, you might have had to do that in the near goddamn month you waited for Pikmin in Japan or 2 weeks in North America, which is likely why the game's brevity was so often brought up negatively in its reviews, in spite of the fact that the critical darling of that year, Devil May Cry, was only 2 to 5 hours long at most. Luigi's Mansion's problem isn't being short, but being padded out in spite of its brevity anyways. As mentioned previously, the game is pretty much linear, but it doesn't present itself that way. It encourages exploration and constant tinkering, testing the mechanics against the environment and memorizing the layout of the mansion in its entirety instead of simply solving the puzzle of whatever you have to do next. As the game goes along, your two main goals are to collect the ghosts inhabiting many of the mansion's rooms, usually receiving keys to new rooms upon doing so, and also to collect the regular boos which are left in the room sometimes after they've been cleared. The most efficient way to accomplish everything would be to enter each room, clear its challenge, collect the treasure from whichever furniture you know to contain it, and then locate and capture the boo immediately. However, because the boos will often fly through the walls into rooms which you don't yet have the keys to, you will most likely go back to trying to progress through the main plot before you continue your attempt at that boo, thus necessitating backtracking later, even though you could have simply reset the boo encounter until you were able to catch it before it leaves. There are moments when Luigi's Mansion offers some player choice by leaving access to several ghost challenges available at once, some of which are completely optional, alongside the ability to go back through the places you've been to figure out what you might have missed. If you've already played through the game, then you'll know that it never presents you with a challenge that you can't tackle immediately, but if you're unsure about whether or not you can actually beat certain ghosts before unlocking another power-up, then you might give up on them and go off to find something else to do. Obnoxiously, the game restarts you at the entrance of the mansion when you die, instead of at the last toad which you spoke to save your game. Anything which you've accomplished before your last save will be preserved, but you'll find yourself at the front door, needing to run all the way back to wherever you were and possibly sit through up to a minute of unskippable cutscene. This started to feel egregious on something like the third boss, which requires quite a trek from the entrance to reach, including a part where you've got to run all the way around the backyard of the house because you don't have the key to this shortcut door. As it turns out, you can get this key by running on a treadmill in the weight room, and I just never found it on my first playthrough. Had I been playing diligently, I would have tested every one of Luigi's possible interactions with every single object in the mansion, but since I wasn't, and since I just assumed that I simply hadn't been given the key yet and would eventually, since it's not like there's any other instance of a key being obtained this way, I never got access to the shortcut, which would have cut a good 30 seconds or more off of my repeated travel time, though still not enough to make me think that there was a real reason for spawning at the entrance as opposed to spawning at a toad. For that matter, it's also kind of a surprise that talking to the toads doesn't restore your health, nor are there commonly health drops after beating individual ghosts. The only time your health is fully restored is after beating each of the first 3 of the game's 4 major bosses, so you're basically in a gauntlet of about 6 ghosts and a boss in each section unless you go on a health run. You will eventually unlock areas where you can guarantee a full health restore, but they're a little out of the way, and if you've got something like 45 health, then you'll probably have to be killed a couple of times before you're convinced that you should go hunt for healing items, even though dying doesn't automatically restore any health from after the last time you saved. I can appreciate the idea that since the ghost battles individually are rarely difficult, they didn't want you to be able to make it through a whole section of game without ever being in danger, but having to go hunt down places with big hearts, resave, and then head back to where you died is a pain in the ass, and making a pilgrimage to a toad for a heal and a save would already do enough to convey the sense of the game being challenging, since you needed to go out of your way to heal, and you wouldn't have to either roll the dice on the RNG of objects which can sometimes yield small hearts, or memorize the few places where you can find big ones. Having said that, it's not as though knowing these spots where the big hearts lie isn't memorable in its own right, and maybe even invited by more patient gamers than I. Before I begin to come off harsh on this game that I do like, let us acknowledge how it has succeeded and been remembered enough to earn a 3DS sequel. Luigi's Mansion nailed the cartoony haunted house aesthetic like no other game before it, coming straight from the Scooby-Doo school of cutesy spooks. It's obvious that the game's use of ghosts as a motif had more to do with trying to justify their mechanics with something pop culturally comprehensible that they could have a Mario character do than it did with what the ghosts suggest thematically in themselves, hence the tone of the game is not really scary, but evokes a feeling of playfulness within the space of what a haunted house story is. If the game seemed to be trying to scare the player and failing, it would come off as annoying, but by characterizing Luigi as a coward who shakes in his boots and whistles the excellent theme song to keep himself comfortable, we can accept the mechanic of him getting stunned by sudden ghost appearances even if we could see it coming. Most of the dialogue is jokey and lighthearted, and would-be shocking moments are comically subverted. The game even ends on a slapstick gag with Mario that finally takes Luigi's tension away with laughter. Nintendo games have long exhibited some of the strongest visual presentations in gaming, especially when their games are zeroed in on a particular theme, and Luigi's Mansion is the cream of the company's crop. At the time the game came out, I remember thinking it practically looked like real life as a kid stepping up from the N64, but like most GameCube games, its visuals have held up because of their clarity rather than density of detail. Many attempts at photorealism from this era on other consoles now look like a blurry mess of textures, while Nintendo's colored 3D models from this game are instantly recognizable. The mansion itself really does stick in your mind, and you'll know your way around it pretty confidently by the end, having felt as if the team pushed the idea of what could be done in this space about as far as they reasonably could without getting a bit esoteric. The central control gimmick and the extent of the setting's creative allowances leave us with a game that basically explored everything interesting it could do in the span of just a few hours, and was structured to lightly obfuscate this while admitting to the limitations of what the controls could actually deliver on well. Aiming with the C-stick ended up being enough of a pain that they included a movement mode in which Luigi can be controlled entirely with just the left thumbstick, and you'll quickly find yourself developing tech such as whipping around in a quick circle when you want to stun a ghost, because it's way faster than trying to turn with the stick. Once you acquire elemental powers, you will realize that when using them on enemies, they will lose 5 health points so long as you touch them with the element at all, and continuously blowing it from your hose will deplete the meter too fast for certain encounters, so your best strategy is to just repeatedly tap the blow button every few seconds. I can imagine that the game was designed this way with the expectation that most players would not be able to maintain a continuous stun lock on enemies, though this is pretty easy to do and results in losing the encounter because you were too good about pinning down the enemy instead of learning exactly how much elemental power you were going to need for that encounter. Capturing all of the game's central 23 ghosts is fun when the rules of each encounter vary somewhat, and certain battles are unexpected shakeups, while the rooms where you battle a large number of small ghosts present a more traditionally arcadey reflexive challenge in enemy crowd management. On top of winning these fights, you'll need to catch a considerable number of the boos, even though collecting every single one is presented as optional and only necessary for getting the highest possible ending grade. Whereas fighting regular ghosts is a matter of aiming your flashlight at and stunning them, and then instantly hammering the right trigger and fishing them up, the boos can't be paralyzed, and so you have to aim the vacuum itself at them. And while it still locks on when you get it right, the boos have a much easier time of breaking out from your grip than the other ghosts, even though they move less. Catching boos ultimately ends up being a pain in the ass because of their ability to jump through walls. Even once you've unlocked all of the rooms in the mansion, when you're trying to catch some of the later ghosts, if you can't manage to maintain perfect traction on them, then you'll be running back and forth through doors after them, which isn't an interesting challenge really in any way and gets old very quickly. So the prospect of going through with it seems less inviting than it would be to simply play through the game normally unless you really love this gameplay. Luigi's Mansion is a solid game with a memorable central control gimmick and aesthetic, which doesn't overstay its welcome or overcomplicate its gameplay beyond some minor shakeups in the name of lengthening it out a little for first-time players. Too many moments in the game feel cheap, such as when the final boss drops on you while you're trying to pick up the bombs you can hurt him with before they explode, and too much of it is randomly driven to be without occasional frustration, but not enough to stop a first playthrough from being overall enjoyable, and the chaff that you can excise if you want to play it again makes the occasional run-through worthwhile on the idea that you could play it better this time, though not likely on the level that you'd find yourself returning to the arcade-style games of companies like Treasure or Platinum. Luigi's Mansion gets a 12 out of 16 on the GameCube Forever scale. It's definitely worth playing for anyone with an interest in the GameCube library or who resonates with the game's aesthetic and mechanical ideas. It's not likely going to blow your mind in 2018, and even in its time it was a modest exploration in compared to what Nintendo was going to bring to the console later, possibly opening the door for similar experiments in short and fairly simple games based on unique mechanics such as the Wii U's Captain Toad's Treasure Tracker. Nevertheless, its frustrations are fleeting and forgivable, and it's well worth the single afternoon of your time it'll take to beat. Check out our live stream show on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 p.m. playing games like Chrono Cross at twitch.tv/IamGames, and head over to our merch page as well if you want to be the games you'd like to see. I Am Games, signing out.